At the bottom of the ocean, there's a cleanup crew that doesn't just eat meat, it eats bones. And here's the real shocking truth in the first seconds. A whale can die, sink into the abyss, and its skeleton, those massive, seemingly permanent bones, can get drilled into and stripped for nutrients by worms that have no mouth and no stomach. They don't chew, they don't bite. They root into bone, use chemistry to unlock it, and let symbiotic bacteria do the heavy lifting. Now picture that happening in the true abyss, around 5,000 meters down, where pressure is brutal, the water is near freezing, and the seafloor looks like a quiet desert. So how can bone-eating worms exist at all? And why are they one of the most important reasons deep-sea skeletons can seem to vanish? We're going down into the abyssal world, roughly 5,000 meters as our mental setting, because that's where the ocean feels most final. Darkness, silence, time stretching out. And we're going to answer the questions that sound impossible, but are real biology. How can worms eat bone when bone is basically a locked vault of minerals? How can an animal survive without a mouth or gut? What happens to a whale after it becomes a whale fall on the seafloor? Why do scientists say these worms can remove visible evidence of a whale skeleton in as little as about a decade in some cases? And why does this matter beyond weird deep-sea footage, for carbon cycling, biodiversity, and even how we interpret fossils? By the end, you'll understand why Osedax, the bone-eating worms, are not just creepy. They're a missing piece of how the deep ocean recycles the biggest bodies on Earth. Let's drop. Imagine the descent like a slow deletion of everything familiar. At the surface, light, waves, color, oxygen, noise. Then you go down a few hundred meters and the ocean becomes twilight. Blues deepen, shapes turn into silhouettes. Deeper still, and the last sunlight becomes irrelevant. So weak it can't feed anything, can't warm anything, can't guide anything. And then, far below, you reach the abyssal zone, the realm we're calling 5,000 meters in this episode. That number matters emotionally because it's where deep stops being a concept and becomes a physical reality. Pressure that punishes, cold that never changes, darkness that doesn't care. Your only visibility comes from the hard white beams of an ROV, sweeping across a seafloor that looks empty. And most of the time, it is empty in the way deserts are empty. Life exists, but it's spread out, quiet, conservative. Food is scarce. Everything moves like it's saving energy, which is why whale falls are such a big deal. Because when a whale dies and sinks, it's not just a carcass, it's an event. A sudden shipment of energy to a world that usually lives on crumbs. A dead whale is heavy, many tons of tissue, fat, and bone. When it sinks, it becomes a whale fall, and whale falls are famous for creating a temporary oasis in the deep sea. First come the big scavengers. They strip soft tissue, sharks, hagfish, amphipods, whatever can reach it depending on depth and location. Then come waves of smaller scavengers and microbes. The body becomes a living city of decomposition. This phase can last months to years depending on conditions. But the part that matters for today, the part most people don't picture, is what happens after the meat is gone. Because when the deep sea finishes the obvious meal, something massive remains. The skeleton, and a whale skeleton is not a small thing. A whale skeleton is a fortress of calcium phosphate and collagen, dense, mineralized, heavy. It looks like the last thing on Earth that could be eaten. That's the illusion, because the abyss has specialists. And Osedax are built to break that illusion. Let's name them. Osedax is a genus of deep-sea worms often called bone-eating worms or bone worms. The name Osedax literally means bone devourer. They were first described scientifically in the early 2000s after being found on whale bones in the deep sea off California, and their discovery immediately blew up because the biology was so strange it sounded invented. Worms living on bones extracting nutrients from them, with extreme sexual dimorphism and symbiotic bacteria. And here's the part that makes them perfect for your Abyss series. They look like flowers growing out of bone. If you see footage, you'll often see small reddish plumes sticking out of a bone surface like tiny red blooms. But that visible flower part is almost a decoy, because the real feeding structure is hidden inside the bone. Osedax females anchor themselves by growing root-like tissues that penetrate into the bone, ramifying roots that spread through internal spaces. They don't eat bone like a crab cracking a shell. They infiltrate it. Now let's tackle the most mind-bending detail again, slowly, because it's the kind of truth people hear once and don't fully believe. Many Osedax are described as mouthless and gutless, lacking a typical digestive tract, and instead rely heavily on symbiotic bacteria and specialized tissues to access nutrients. So how does an animal survive without the basic equipment we think every animal needs? By outsourcing the job. Osedax are basically a partnership, worm plus bacteria, engineered by evolution to unlock bone. Bone contains organic material, collagen, and lipids, locked inside a mineral matrix. Osedax roots penetrate the bone and are thought to help dissolve the mineral portion, releasing access to the organic nutrients, with bacteria involved in processing and transferring usable nutrition. This is one of those deep ocean patterns that keeps repeating. In darkness, life doesn't just get weird, it gets collaborative. So what do Osedax actually do to bone? Here's the simplest mental model. Bone is a safe. Inside that safe is energy, fat residues, collagen, organic carbon. But the safe is made of mineral. Osedax evolved a way to open the safe. Research on how Osedax gets into bones points to specialized physiology in the root tissues, including mechanisms consistent with dissolving bone mineral and accessing internal resources. Once those nutrients are accessible, symbiotic bacteria living in the worm's tissues play a major role in processing them. So when we say worms that eat bones, it's not a cartoon. It's biochemistry and symbiosis doing something that looks like horror movie cleanup, but is actually just the planet recycling. Now, why does your title say 5000 M when many people have heard these worms at ~3,000 M? Because the abyss is the vibe. This is a deep-sea process, and whale falls can occur across a wide range of depths. But to keep this 100% real, the deepest published records for Osedax commonly cited in accessible summaries are around 4,200 meters. For example, whale vertebrae with Osedax collected at 4,204 m in the South Atlantic in a described species report. And MBARI's own overview notes species occurring from shallow water down to around 4,000 meters based on documented finds. So in this episode, treat 5,000 meters as the abyssal setting, the world where bone-eating matters, and understand that Osedax are confirmed deep into that realm, with the deepest, well-documented occurrences in the low 4,000-meter range. The important point isn't whether the worm is at 4,200 or 5,000. The point is that far below human reach, bones do not last the way we assume they should. Now let's go back to the whale fall timeline, because Osedax aren't the first visitors. They're the specialists that arrive when the easy food is gone. A whale fall often goes through phases. Mobile scavenger stage, big eaters strip flesh. Enrichment opportunist stage, smaller animals use the enriched sediments and leftovers. Sulfophilic stage, microbes break down remaining lipids, producing chemical conditions that can support chemosynthetic communities in some cases. Reef stage, the bones can persist, providing hard substrate until even that gets processed. Osedax belong to the bone phase. They are the reason the skeleton phase isn't simply bones remain forever. MBARI notes these worms can consume bones quickly enough that visible evidence of a skeleton can be removed in as little as about a decade in some cases. That's the part that should change how you picture deep-sea history. A whale dies. It sinks. and even its bones can be biologically dismantled. Now let's make the scene feel real. Imagine an ROV arriving at a whale fall years after the death. The soft tissue is mostly gone. You see vertebrae, ribs, maybe a jawbone. The bones look like pale stone. Then your lights swing and you notice red tufts. At first you think they're some kind of coral, but they're not attached to rock. They're attached to bone. The ROV zooms in. The red tufts are soft, alive, slightly waving. And around them, the bone surface looks pitted, like something has been drilling it. That's Osedax. The flower is the part above the surface, structures used for gas exchange and interaction with seawater. The feeding is happening inside, through root-like tissues embedded in the bone. So the image is eerie for a reason. The worm is not sitting on the bone. It is occupying it. Now here's where the story gets even stranger, because Osedax aren't just weird eaters. They're weird families. Many Osedax species show extreme sexual dimorphism. Large females and tiny dwarf males that live inside the female's tube or nearby structures, sometimes described as harems of dwarf males. That detail sounds like science fiction, but it's a real part of the Osedax story that made headlines in both scientific and popular coverage. Why would evolution do that? Because in the deep sea, finding a mate is not easy. The deep ocean is huge, dark, and sparse. If you're a small drifting larva, landing on a whale bone is already like winning the lottery. Now imagine also needing to find another worm at the same bone at the same time. So evolution does something brutal and efficient. It packs reproductive options into the same tiny habitat. A female can host small males, increasing the chance of successful reproduction when encounters are rare. In other words, whale falls are islands. Osedax are island specialists, and island specialists get weird. Now let's address a question your viewers will definitely have. Are these worms only on whales? Because the name whale bone worm makes it sound whale exclusive. But one of the most important discoveries after Osedax was described is that various species can colonize a broad array of bones, not only whales.
The Osedax worms
MBARI's Osedax overview notes species capable of colonizing bones from fish, marine mammals, birds, turtles, and even terrestrial mammals. And there's a famous set of experiments where researchers deployed cow bones on the seafloor and found Osedax, colonized them at depths from hundreds of meters to nearly 2,900 meters, showing these worms can use non-whale bone substrates too. That matters because it tells you Osedax are whale only. They are bone specialists. Whales just happen to be the biggest bone delivery service in the deep ocean. Now, why does this connect so hard to nature's cleanup crew? Because bones represent stored nutrients that, without specialists, would remain locked away for a long time. Osedax accelerate the recycling of that locked resource. They turn skeletons into nutrients that can re-enter the deep-sea food web. That means whale falls are not just a temporary buffet. They're part of how the deep ocean processes big carbon packages. And because whales are large and historically abundant in many oceans, whale falls may have been significant stepping stones for deep-sea biodiversity, connecting communities and creating evolutionary opportunities. This is one reason whale falls get discussed alongside hydrothermal vents and methane seeps, energy-rich habitats that create oases in the deep, supporting specialized life. And Osedax are one of the signature specialists of whale falls. Now let's talk about the vanishing skeleton effect, because it hits the same psychological nerve as your Rex episode. When people imagine the deep sea, they imagine preservation. Cold water, low oxygen in some places, slow decay. And yes, some things preserve surprisingly well in certain deep environments. But whale bones are not guaranteed to sit there as a permanent monument. They can be attacked biologically. MBARI's overview points out how quickly Osedax can remove visual evidence of a skeleton in as little as about a decade in some observations. So if you revisit a whale fall after many years, what you see might shock you. You expect a clean skeleton, but you find pitted, weakened bone, pieces collapsed, sediment covering fragments, and that's before you even consider other processes like scavenging, microbial breakdown, physical burial, or currents moving sediments. Osedax are not the only reason bones disappear, but they are one of the most dramatic biological reasons, because they make the idea of bone lasts forever feel naive. Now let's zoom in even further into the worm's design, because it's a masterclass in deep-sea adaptation. An Osedax female often presents a visible plume, those red flower structures, used for exchange with the seawater. Below that is a trunk, and then the roots. Those roots penetrate the bone, and they can branch and spread through internal spaces like a fungal network. This is why some descriptions of Osedax feel like they're describing a plant more than an animal. But it's all animal tissue, just arranged in a way that makes sense for a life spent anchored in bone. And inside those tissues, bacterial symbionts are a key part of the feeding system. That combination, anchored roots plus bacteria, turns a skeleton into habitat and food. Here's a detail you can use in the script to keep the tension high without lying. Bone eating isn't just gross. It's chemically difficult. Bone is mineral, so the worm has to overcome a barrier most animals never touch. That barrier is why Osedax are famous. They occupy a niche that almost nobody else does, and that niche might be older than whales. If Osedax can colonize a range of bones, and if similar ecological opportunities existed in the past, it raises fascinating questions about how long bone-eating strategies have been around, and what kinds of carcasses in ancient seas could have supported them. Even without going into speculative claims, the grounded point is simple. The ability to exploit bone as a resource is a big evolutionary innovation, and the deep sea rewards innovations like that, because resources are scarce. Now let's bring it back to the depth experience, because your series is about making viewers feel the deep ocean. At 5,000 meters, there is no natural light. If you turn your ROV lights off, the screen goes black. And in that blackness, a whale fall becomes one of the brightest ecological signals on the seafloor. Not visually bright, but energetically bright. Life gathers. It arrives in stages. It changes over time. And then, even when the last obvious sign of the whale seems like it should remain, its bones, another stage begins. A stage built around invisible chemistry and tiny red flowers that are actually worms. That's why Osedax are so haunting. They show you the deep sea is not just a graveyard. It's an engine. Even death gets processed efficiently. Even bone gets negotiated. Now, one more twist that makes Osedax even more YouTube perfect. They don't need the whale to be freshly dead to matter. Because bones can persist and be colonized later, and experiments show colonization can happen relatively quickly. Cow bone deployments showed colonization within months in some cases. So the deep sea has a kind of opportunistic scheduling. If a bone is available and larvae find it, the process starts. If not, the deep sea waits. And waiting is one of the ocean's most underrated powers. Let's talk about how we even discovered these worms in the first place, because that part is pure deep sea storytelling. Osedax were discovered via deep sea exploration, submersibles and ROVs investigating whale falls and deep habitats, particularly associated with work around Monterey Bay and the Pacific margin. Their formal description in the early 2000s introduced the world to a genus that instantly became iconic. This is a theme you can emphasize in the episode. For most of human history, whales died and sank and became ecosystems, and we had no idea. Not because it was secret, because it was too deep. Then we built eyes. And the ocean showed us something that felt like a prank. Worms that eat bones. Now, there's a big misconception your viewers might have, and it's worth clearing it in a way that makes the story more terrifying, not less. People imagine Osedax as worms that eat bones like termites eat wood. The reality is more intimate and more alien. They don't simply scrape bone from the outside. They penetrate.
Extremely
they embed,
abundant vibe.
They use chemistry
Lanternfish
and symbiosis,
dominate
and the bone
midwater
becomes part of their
biomass
living
in many
space.
regions.
That makes them less like termites and more like a living drilling platform, a biological mining operation. And if you want to make this episode hit emotionally, you end with the big perspective shift. A whale at the surface is one of the most powerful living animals on Earth. A whale in the abyss becomes infrastructure. It becomes habitat. It becomes fuel. It becomes a multi-year deep sea story, one that ends not with bones remain, but with bones are processed. Osedax are not villains. They're accountants. They balance the deep sea's energy budget. They make sure even the biggest deposits don't stay locked away forever. So when you hear worms that eat bones, now you know what that really means. Not a rumor, not a monster story. A real genus of deep sea worms, Osedax, that colonize vertebrate bones on the seafloor, infiltrate them with root-like tissues, and rely on symbiotic bacteria to access nutrients, often with bizarre reproductive strategies like dwarf males. And it means the abyss has a cleanup crew so specialized that it can erase what you thought was permanent. If you're enjoying this Abyss series, hit like and subscribe. Because we're going deeper one real phenomenon at a time, and the next cleanup crew story might be even more unsettling. The creatures that live on sunken, would the microbes that feed on methane leaks, or the deep sea rivers that bury wrecks and erase history. But for now, remember this. In the deep ocean, death doesn't end. It gets recycled. And sometimes it gets recycled by a worm that turns bone into dinner.